Hello, sweet peas and sugar dumplings. This is your gay auntie here for another fantastic story time. I'm excited to do this because we're going to switch gears here for this post and read stories from Reddit. I know several other people do it, but I figured let's get some new life to horror and spookiness. And this one has been given permission to be read, and it is written by an author by the name of Nerdxcorexneal. And the title of it is called If You Love Me. So pause here to go get yourself some snacks, something to drink, and get all cuddled up, and we're gonna enjoy this spooky, delightful tale. Welcome back if you stopped to get some snackies and get all cuddled up. Before we begin, I want to remind you that I work with an organization called Rainbow Youth Project. No, this is not sponsored. They are a non-profit that provides a lot of services to LGBTQI+ youths across the country. Services like mental health, care, suicide call hotline or crisis center, and the LGBTQI+ youth housing. Homeless youth housing for tons of those LGBTQI+ youths that have been kicked out. And unfortunately, it happens far more often than people know. And in other unfortunate circumstances, helps pay for those youths' funerals if they unalive themselves. So, consider donating to them. I'll have a link down in the description box below, or you can find them at rainbowyouthprojectibelieve.org. Now, thank you so much. Of course, that was not sponsored. I just like helping out. I am a subscription-based content creator through Patreon. If you want to become a patron, that'd help me keep my bills paid, and now help keep my mama's bills paid. So, let's get into the story. I love you, and let's go. If You Love Me by Nerdxcorexneal. I love my wife above all else. I have loved her since the moment I first laid eyes on her, and I will do anything for her. And that has never changed after all these years. We first met in college. We were both theater majors, and it was day one of Acting 1 class that our eyes first met. She had chocolate brown eyes that were complemented by her dark, curly hair. We stared at each other constantly that first day, and we were partnered together. We knew that it was fate. "My name is Margaret," she said as soon as I walked up to her after class. I took her by the hand and kissed it. "Henry," I responded. She then took one of my long dreadlocks and wrapped it around her finger, staring me in the eyes and biting her lip. It was an amazing meeting with an even better ending later that night. The following night, we went on our first date, a theater production of Sueño. We held each other's hand through the entire performance, and afterward, I walked her to her dormitory. Every day after that was like a love story. We went through good times and bad times. We broke up and got back together, but through it all, one thing had never changed for me. I loved her and would do anything for her. We got married after graduation and went on to become very successful in the stage acting scene. We were considered a power couple and would always cast in romantic roles opposite each other. It was easy to bring the true deep love that we felt for each other on stage, and it was nice to make money from it. One day, our lives took a turn, however. We had just finished a successful performance of the stage play, The Clean House, when we were approached by a member of the audience. "That was an amazing performance," he said in a creepy accent behind his words. "Why, thank you. You're sweet," said Margaret, gripping my hand. I could tell this guy had creeped her out, but being a talented actress, she was able to put on a nice front. "I've been watching you two for a very long time," he continued, his pale blue eyes staring into Margaret. "I am very much a fan of your work. Every performance is riveting, and I can tell that you put true passion into your exchanges. You two must truly love each other." "We do," I said, stepping slightly in front of Margaret. "We love each other very much, and I would do anything for her. I looked at her, and she gave me that beautiful smile of hers. That warms my heart to hear, he said as he put his arms behind his back and looked up into the night sky. True love is a valuable gift that is often taken for granted. If you're not careful, you can easily lose it forever, and it can never be replaced, no matter how hard you try. He then looked at me. I could see just how disturbing his pale blue eyes were. Hold on to that gift. Cherish it forever. He began to walk away before I asked the question that had been bothering me since we met. Who are you? I yelled. He stopped and turned his head. Your biggest fan, he answered. He then walked away, and Margaret and I looked at each other, baffled at what had just taken place. Later that night, we were sitting on our couch watching a movie when suddenly there was a knock at the door. I wonder who that could be, said Margaret, as she got up to see who it was. She looked at the peephole and froze in place before taking a step back and opened the door. Standing just outside the door was the same man we had talked to earlier that night. He stood there with his arms behind him, his pale blue eyes shining like the moon. Honey? I said, standing up from the couch to join Margaret at the door. Please, come in, Margaret said to the man. To my shock, what are you doing? I yelled, running to get to the door. The man stepped in before I could get there and began to stroke her face. When I finally got to them, I threw my fist and connected with his face, knocking him back outside. I quickly slammed the door and locked it. I turned to Margaret, who was in some sort of trance. I tried to snap her out of it. Margaret, I yelled, shaking her. Margaret, wake up! There was nothing I could do to get a response. I shook her, slapped her, and even splashed water in her face, and nothing would work. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. I looked around until I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside our living room window. I blinked, and it was gone, and I began to panic and ran to the gun safe in our bedroom. Despite being theater nerds, we knew how for self-defense, and we had firearms. When I got back to the living room, I immediately raised my weapon. There stood the strange man, holding Margaret by the face. Let go of her, I yelled, aiming for his head. He looked at me. The only thing I could see in the darkness was glowing red eyes. He turned his head to Margaret, and I fired, hitting him directly in the head. He fell to the floor hard, and I ran over. Margaret fell over too, but I managed to somehow catch her. She still would not respond, her eyes wide open in a trance. I looked over at the man, but he was gone. I gently laid her on the floor and stood up quickly, readying the weapon once again, and suddenly I felt a strong, tight grip on the back of my neck, and I was thrown across the room, hitting the wall. I groaned in pain as I grabbed my gun and slowly stood to my feet, shaking as I raised my weapon again. Again, he had a hold of Margaret, but this time he pulled her head close to his. I felt my heart race and my blood boil as he put his lips to her lips to his. His glowing red eyes staring right at me. No! I screamed as I ran towards them. He then pushed her to the side and opened his arms to me as if inviting me to fire on him again, and I obliged, fired 5 rounds into him, but all he did was allow them to connect as he laughed. I ran up to him, but he grabbed me by the throat before I could do anything. He pulled me close to his face, and I could see every horrifying feature. Not only did he have those red eyes, but his face was covered in disgusting, pulsating veins. His mouth were 2 sharp fangs and a long, slimy tongue, which rubs against my face as if tasting me before taking his first bite. I lifted my gun to the arm that held me firm and fired twice. He growled in pain and released me, and I connected the butt of the gun to his face repeatedly. He fell to the floor, and I mounted him, smashing his face more and more and harder and faster, and felt the blood gush and spray all over the bones in his face, crack and collapse. By the time I was done, I was exhausted, but there was nothing but smashed bones and viscera. I panted as I stood back up and limped over to Margaret, who was now fully unconscious. I shook her, and she finally opened her eyes, looking into mine with fear and confusion. "Margaret," I said, feeling relieved that she was all right. I held her close and we laid there until I looked over where the body of the stranger should have been. He was gone. A panic rose up against me, again in me, and we both stood up quickly. I turned to face Margaret and screamed when I saw him standing behind her, still in the progress of regenerating his face, and before I had a chance to react or think, he sunk his face deep into Margaret's neck. She screamed in pain as I screamed in rage. Hitting the monster in the skull once again with my gun, I felt the bone crack again as he released her. Again, I mounted him and went to work. Growing exhausted the longer I went, I knew this wouldn't last, as he would surely regenerate again. It soon became obvious what exactly I was dealing with. He put Margaret into a trance merely by looking at her, even looking through a peephole. It wasn't until she invited him inside that he actually got in. He had glowing red eyes and fangs, and he bit Margaret in the neck. He's a vampire, I thought to myself, if it wasn't obvious. While he was down, I ran into the kitchen and grabbed an old wooden broom, broke it in half, and ran back to the body, where I rammed it as hard as I could directly into his heart. The body began to convulse and flail its arms and legs all over, and suddenly it stopped and went completely limp, before melting away into a deep red blood and other disgusting fluids. After catching my breath, I turned my attention to Margaret, and she sat there in darkness, legs folded and upper torso fully erect. "Honey?" I said, nervously approaching her. In the darkness, I could only see her silhouette until her eyes began to slowly glow red. There was only one thing I could think to do. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, even if that meant chaining her up in the basement and feeding her a pint of my own blood every day while I figured out what to do. When the hunger would hit her, she became like a wild animal that cannot be communicated with, so I fed her my blood and she became herself again. She understood the situation and never held it against me. It wasn't easy, but it was all we could do. Unfortunately, a pint only went so far until soon it wasn't enough. So I gave her more and more until the point that I was in danger myself with so much blood loss. It was then that I decided to feed her full meals. It started with small animals at first, and then cats and dogs, and soon I made the hard decision to invite homeless people into our home, knock them out, and give them to her. This went on for far too long before it really started to affect us. She felt like a monster, and I did too. I love my wife, and I would do anything for her, which brings me to now. I'm sitting here, right this, shaking. There is literal blood on my hands as I try to compose myself. She asked me to do one last thing for her. I refused, at first, because I love her too much. "If you love me," she began, looking me deep in the eyes, her now pale blues not blinking, "you will do this." Tears fell from both of our eyes as I pulled her in close. "I love you, Margaret," I whispered. "I love you, Henry," she responded. I could hear the squish as I drove the wooden stake in her heart. I trembled as I listened to her whimpers, gasps, and eventual silence. I broke down as her body melted away into liquid, and I laid there in her remains, sobbing. I sit here now with nothing left but the warning about the creatures of fiction that are very much a reality. I write my confession of the crimes I've committed out of love. I say goodbye to any friends or loved ones that may be reading this. I loved her, and I did everything for her. I hope you enjoyed this first time me reading a story off of Reddit. Once again, the author was Nerdxcorexneal. I personally have always loved creepypastas that come from Reddit. They are one of my favorite things. But I also love a good Edgar Allan Poe moment. The ones I have left on Edgar Allan Poe are longer, and I want to create that content for y'all. So look forward and stay tuned for that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I am a subscription model content creator. So my livelihood is made not through sponsorships, but through patrons on my Patreon. So if you like my content and would like to help me continue, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon for low as $3 a month, where you get full access to me, long form inspirational content, first peeks at the videos like this, and you can even message me directly and I'll respond because it is me. Anyway, as always, I love you. Remember to tuck yourself in and treat yourself right. And you take care, baby doll. A special thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon who make this content possible. I am truly grateful and honored to have you as patrons, and I couldn't do this without you. You take care, and remember, I love you, honey.